In this video, we will look at the executions carried out in the United States during the month of September. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. On September 17, 2025, after spending 32 years on death row, David Joseph Pittman was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. But to understand how he ended up on death row in the first place, we have to go back to a spring night in 1990 when the night sky lit up with flames. On May 15, 1990, 28-year-old David left his house around 2:30 in the morning. From there, it was only a half-mile walk to the house of his soon-to-be ex-family-in-law. He just wanted to talk, he had told himself, but somewhere along that quiet 13-minute walk, deep down, he realized that wasn't going to happen. When he reached the house, he climbed the fence near the backyard shed and crept to the side. He tapped on Bonnie Jo's window, waking her up. And at first, it really did seem like he only wanted a conversation. He sat down with her and told her about the problems he was having with her family, how they were making things worse. But then the tone shifted. He brought up the 1985 allegation, the one that had torn everything apart. Why had she told him that he raped her back then? Bonnie Jo reminded him of what happened, reminded him she had only been 15, and told him the truth he still didn't want to hear. But the conversation kept unraveling. David started pointing to her personal issues, questioning her mental health, trying to twist things. Then he asked if she wanted to have sex. She said no. She explained that she was on her period, but David wouldn't drop it. He kept suggesting other things, oral sex, stories, anything to wear her down, and that's when Bonnie Jo had enough. She wanted him out, and she told him to leave. But he refused. She tried to scream, hoping to wake her parents, but David panicked. He lunged forward and clamped his hand over her mouth, desperate to silence her before anyone could hear. And what happened next was brutal. He struck Bonnie Jo hard, and in that moment, something inside him snapped. He slashed her throat, then stabbed her over and over until her body went still. But the attack wasn't quiet. The noise jolted her mother, Barbara, awake. She rushed out of the bedroom, but as she came down the hallway toward Bonnie Jo's room, David stepped out and drove the knife into her too. By then, Clarence had heard the screams. He ran for the phone in the living room, but David was too fast. Before he could call for help, David snatched the receiver, beat him down, and stabbed him until he collapsed by the hallway telephone. It was fast and brutal, and in just a few minutes, 3 members of the Knowles family were dead. But David didn't run. He knew he would be the first name on the suspect list, and he had to buy himself time. He needed the scene to look like an accident, something unexpected, not planned, so he went looking for gasoline. In the shed, he found a can, brought it inside, and began pouring fuel across the house. He shoved a tire under Bonnie's bed to make the fire burn hotter in her room, then kept going, splashing fuel into every corner. Covered in blood, he took time to wash himself in the bathroom while the air filled with the sharp, sick smell of gasoline. After that, he carried the can out to Bonnie's car, tossed it in the back seat, and grabbed her keys. Then, without looking back, he lit the house on fire. Flames spread fast, and within seconds, the home was ablaze and David disappeared into the night. Just a couple of minutes later, at 3:36 a.m., a newspaper delivery man spotted flames up to 25 feet tearing across the sky. He immediately called authorities, and by the time firefighters got there at 3:42, the Knowles home was already swallowed by fire. People nearby said they heard a blast cut through the quiet, loud and sharp like an explosion. It tore half the roof clean off, leaving a massive hole above the burning house. The other side somehow held together, but inside, everything was gone. The rooms were gutted, walls scorched black, furniture melted, and floors reduced to ash. Fire crews fought it hard for about 30 minutes before the main blaze finally gave out. The fire had started in the living room, the very heart of the house, before spreading fast and swallowing everything in its path. The firefighters stayed for another hour, tracking down hot spots that kept flaring up, like the one in Bonnie Jo's bedroom. The damage there was worse than anywhere else. The walls were charred, the ceiling collapsed, and the floor completely gone. And then they saw why. Someone had stuffed an old car tire under the middle of her bed. It acted like a torch, burning hotter, longer, and more aggressively than anything else in the house. The fire in that room wasn't just meant to destroy, it was meant to erase everything. And that wasn't the only thing they found. Inside the burned house were the bodies of Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie Jo. But it wasn't the fire that had killed them. The medical examiner revealed the truth. They were already dead before the flames began. Bonnie Jo had been stabbed 8 times. Each wound was deep enough to be fatal on its own, and together they caused massive blood loss, leading to a quick death. Barbara's injuries told the same story. She had 3 stab wounds, 1 in the neck and 2 to the chest. The chest wounds pierced her aorta, killing her in minutes, 5 at most. And just like Bonnie Jo, she was gone long before the fire was ever lit. Clarence was stabbed 5 times. 1 was shallow, but the other 4 were devastating, each cutting deep into his chest cavity. They, too, caused massive bleeding, and within minutes, Clarence was dead. Tests confirmed the same detail as with Barbara and Bonnie Jo. There was no soot in his airways, no sign that he had breathed in smoke. The burns all came after. The fire had been meant to cover the crime, but the knife had already done its work. And by sunrise, it turned out that the trail of fire hadn't ended at the Knowles house. Around 6:30 that morning, a construction worker showed up for his shift and spotted something unusual. A brown Toyota, seemingly stuck in a ditch near his job site, less than a mile from the crime scene. Not long after, a homemade wrecker pulled up beside the car. The worker watched as a man got out, and moments later, thick smoke poured into the air. The Toyota was on fire. A nearby neighbor saw it too. She watched the smoke rising, then noticed a man running away from the burning car. Later, when police showed her a lineup, she picked David Pittman out of it without hesitation. And when the construction workers saw the same lineup, he confirmed it as well. Detectives quickly confirmed what was already obvious. The car fire wasn't an accident. Just like the house fire hours earlier, it had been set on purpose. Another attempt to erase the evidence and cover up what had happened. And now, investigators knew exactly who they were looking at. At the time of the murders, David's ties to the Knowles family were already tense. He was in the middle of a bitter divorce from 23-year-old Barbara Marie, the other daughter of Clarence and Barbara. And the split was ugly. Witnesses later said David had made repeated threats, not just toward Marie, but toward her whole family. He had met her when she was 18 and he was 23, and he came off as independent, a guy who wanted to stand on his own. They married within 2 months, and the babies came just as fast. But the marriage slid into anger and threats, and the children ended up living under the care of their grandparents, Clarence and Barbara. That made what happened inside that house even harder to take, because this wasn't just violence against former in-laws. It was an attack on the very home where his own children had been raised. And there was more. Investigators learned that David had recently found out Bonnie Jo tried to file criminal charges against him, accusing him of raping her 5 years earlier. But she had waited too long. By the time she came forward, the case had already fallen outside the statute of limitations. And David also pushed back, saying the was consensual and happened before he married Marie. That wasn't he told anyone who asked. But the accusation didn't just go away. It just added another layer of tension, one that prosecutors later said gave David a powerful motive to silence Bonnie Jo forever. Stacked on top of the bitter divorce, it gave the state what it wanted, a clear and undeniable motive. The day after the murders, May 16th, David sensed that the police were already closing in on him, and at his mother's insistence, he finally turned himself in. But even behind bars, he couldn't keep quiet. He told Carl Hugas, a fellow prisoner and jailhouse informant, and he laid out everything that had happened. But something didn't add up. Despite his statements, there was no physical evidence tying David directly to the scene or to Bonnie's car. His fingerprints didn't match the ones pulled from her Toyota. No murder weapon was ever found. And when investigators examined his clothes, there were no burns, no blood, nothing that placed him at the center of the violence he had described. His trial began in 1991, 1 year after Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie were found dead inside their burning home. Prosecutors charged him with 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with arson and grand theft. And when David finally stood before the court, he pleaded not guilty, insisting he had nothing to do with the killings. But the evidence stacked against him, witnesses, threats, and his own statements to others, told a different story. And by November 1991, the verdict was in. The jury found him guilty on every count except burglary, and the case moved into the penalty phase. That's where his violent history and the cruelty of the murders weighed heavily, and the question was no longer what happened, but what price he would pay for it. During sentencing, prosecutors reminded the jury of David's violent past, including an aggravated assault conviction from 1985. The defense called his mother, who described beating him as a child, with belts, broom handles, and even Hot Wheels tracks. She said she beat him almost daily, sometimes every day. Once, after he spilled a can of stain in the house, she forced him to sit on a bench in the kitchen for 7 days straight, leaving only to use the bathroom. When asked if she feared child services would intervene, her response was chilling. "I told them, if you want to call them, call them. They may put me in jail, and I may have to spend the night, but sooner or later, they're going to let me out. And when they let me out, you're going to the hospital. If you want to put me in jail, fine." The defense also brought in a psychologist who specialized in brain disorders and child psychology. He told the court that David suffered from severe ADHD, brain damage, and mood instability, and he explained that this wasn't just a kid acting out. It was a life built on dysfunction. David's father had been a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic who died in an institution, and his half-brother struggled with the same illness. Tests put David's IQ in the normal range, but his memory scored worse than 99% of the population. The psychologist told the jury that with alcohol added to his brain damage and stress, David could have been borderline psychotic, so far gone that he lost touch with reality during the murders. The defense argued this background didn't excuse the murders, but according to them, it did explain them, and they hoped that claim would be enough to save David from the death penalty. But it wasn't. After hearing the testimony, the jury voted 9-3 to recommend death for each of the murder convictions. Then, on April 12, 1991, the judge made it official. He agreed with the jury's recommendation, citing aggravating factors, and sentenced David Joseph Pittman to die for the murders of Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie Knowles, calling the crimes heinous, atrocious, and cruel. For the next 32 years, David fought to escape the death penalty. His lawyers filed motion after motion, raising claims of misconduct, unfair procedures, and questions about his mental state, but every challenge ended the same way: denied. Judges upheld the verdict, the sentence, and the death penalty. And eventually, a date was set: September 17, 2025. David's final appeal was denied by the U.S. Supreme Court on the 26th, and by the next morning, the end was already in motion. He woke up at 5:45 a.m. under the same cold lights that had marked every day on death row. Hours later, he sat down for his final meal: steak, chicken, and biscuits, quiet, knowing there was nothing left to fight. Then, just before 6 p.m., they strapped him to the gurney. When asked if he had any final words, David didn't hesitate. "I know you all came to watch an innocent man be murdered by the state of Florida. I am innocent. I didn't kill anybody. That's it," he said. The execution moved forward without any complications. The staff followed the standard checks, calling his name and brushing his eyelashes, but he gave no response. At 6:12 p.m., he was pronounced dead. David Joseph Pittman was 63 years old. The next execution took place on September 25, 2025. After spending more than 15 years on death row, Blaine Keith Milam was executed by lethal injection in Texas. But to understand how he ended up on death row, we have to go back to December 2008, to an exorcism gone wrong inside a small home in Rusk County.
She was a great little girl. She was beautiful. I loved her and Jessica.
At 10:37 a.m. on December 2, 2008, 18-year-old Blaine dialed 911. His voice was flat, almost numb. "My name is Blaine Milam," he said, "and my daughter, I just found her dead." 20 minutes later, Sergeant Kevin Roy from the Rusk County Sheriff's Office arrived at Blaine's trailer just outside of Tatum. 2 ambulances were already on the scene. Inside, EMTs stood frozen in the bedroom doorway while Blaine and his fiancée, Jessica Bain Carson, sat on the floor, in tears. In front of them lay 13-month-old Amora Bain Carson. She wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing, and her tiny face was covered in one massive bruise. According to detectives, it was the worst crime scene they had ever seen. At first, Sergeant Roy thought the circular marks on her body looked like someone had hit a Coke can against her head over and over again. But what he didn't realize at that moment was that they were human bite marks. According to Blaine, he and Jessica had left Amora alone for about an hour while they met a man just up the road about clearing some land. And when they returned, he said, they found Amora already like that. Both seemed very cooperative, and Blaine even told a Texas Ranger who questioned him that authorities could search his car and trailer. From the start, he denied any involvement and offered to take a polygraph test to prove his innocence. But the story began to fall apart almost immediately. The man Blaine said he met that morning told investigators he hadn't seen him at all. Then, pawn shop employees came forward. They remembered seeing Blaine and Jessica that day, pawning off tools like nothing was wrong. They were even caught on surveillance cameras. But the final blow came from someone closer, his own sister. She told investigators that Blaine had called her in tears before 9:30 a.m., saying he had found Amora dead. Yet, 911 wasn't called until more than an hour later, and by then, too much damage had already been done. But what really happened inside that trailer? Jessica was only 17 when she met Blaine in 2008, and their relationship moved fast. On prom night, he proposed, and within months, she had left her family and moved in with him. At first, Blaine seemed to care for her and her little girl, Amora. But as the months went on, Jessica became distant, withdrawn, and unrecognizable to those who knew her best. She stopped caring about her appearance, cut ties with her family, and began repeating claims that her mother had killed her father, a story no one could make sense of. To outsiders, the change was clear. Blaine had taken control. By fall, Jessica's friends and family rarely saw her, and when they did, Blaine was always there. She never left the apartment without Blaine and even had to accompany him to his work. Blaine didn't just isolate her. He controlled her, tracking her movements, reading her messages, even logging into her accounts with her passwords. And while people around them saw something was wrong, no one could get through. Together, they spiraled deeper into delusion. A Ouija board became their new obsession. They believed it connected them to their dead fathers, and the messages they claimed to receive only made things worse. Jessica started to believe what the board was telling them, that her mother was dangerous and their home was filled with demons. And Blaine fed into those beliefs. He didn't just encourage them, he shaped them. Jessica, struggling with addiction and slipping further from reality, trusted him completely. So when he told her that Amora, her own child, was possessed by a demon, she didn't question it. She just listened, and she went along with what came next. On December 1st, 2008, 18-year-old Blaine took Amora into a back bedroom, claiming God had shown him how to perform an exorcism. Jessica could hear the cries and the screams, but she convinced herself it wasn't really her daughter, that this was just a trick of the demon inside her, trying to make her stop the exorcism. So she did nothing. while Blaine stayed in that room for hours carrying out the so-called exorcism, Jessica sat in the living room, sometimes watching TV, sometimes just listening. She later admitted that she thought her daughter would be better off in heaven than left to Satan, so she stayed put. In the end, she wasn't just a witness. She became part of it. She stood by while Blaine tortured her daughter for more than 30 hours until her small body couldn't take it anymore. Amora's injuries were so severe her body was almost unrecognizable. Her bones had been twisted and broken. She was covered in bite marks. Her skull was fractured so badly that it looked like a jigsaw puzzle torn apart. The autopsy showed clear signs of sexual abuse. And while any one of the injuries she suffered could have been fatal on their own, together they told a story of hours of suffering that no one should ever go through. And the worst part? Jessica was in the trailer the entire time. She heard the sounds, she saw her daughters swollen, and instead of stopping it, she told Blaine to keep going, to do whatever was necessary to cast out the so-called demon. She didn't call for help, she just let her die. A few days after the murder, investigators returned to Blaine's trailer and searched more carefully. That's when they found what they believed to be the murder weapon, a blood-stained pipe wrench hidden under the bathroom floor. Forensic testing confirmed it was Amora's blood, and the bite mark analysis matched Blaine's teeth. But the case didn't end there. While in jail, Blaine finally broke down. He handed a nurse a note and asked to speak with Sergeant Rogers. He was crying. "I'm going to confess," he said. "I did it. But Miss Shirley, the Blaine you know did not do this. My dad told me to be a man, and I've been reading my Bible. Please tell Jessica I love her." And with that, the truth, or at least Blaine's version of it, started to come out. And what he told police would shock everyone involved. This wasn't a murder, he said. It was an exorcism. Blaine told the police that the baby had been possessed, that a demon had taken hold of Amora. He claimed God had shown him what to do, how to drive it out. He and Jessica had even tried to pawn items earlier that day, hoping to raise money to pay a priest to perform the exorcism. But when that didn't work out, Blaine insisted he could do it himself. And Jessica, by her own testimony, stood by, believing he was doing the right thing. But when investigators walked into that trailer after Blaine's 911 call, they didn't find a demon. What they found was a body covered in bruises, bite marks, and broken bones. The so-called exorcism was nothing more than torture, and the evidence of it was written across every inch of Amora's body. The case against Blaine only grew stronger with time. His own story unraveled piece by piece, replaced by a clearer picture, one lined with blood, lies, and the brutal truth of what had happened to Amora. And after he was taken into custody, even more disturbing facts came to light. At the time of the murder, Blaine was already serving probation for solicitation of aggravated sexual assault. That case dated back to a break-in, where he entered a neighbor's home and left pages torn from pornographic magazines, scribbled with disturbing notes hidden in the dresser of their 11-year-old daughter, Kara. His probation terms had been strict. He wasn't allowed within 200 feet of places where children gathered. This means that he was already in violation by being around Amora at all. And during trial, the jury heard a patrol car recording between Blaine and Texas Ranger Kenny Ray. In it, Blaine casually admitted to the prior assaults, brushing them off as if his victims had it coming. And the picture painted by witnesses of Blaine's character wasn't any better. His former landlord recalled how he and Jessica left their apartment trashed. Food rotting in the fridge, a hunting knife hidden in the toilet tank, and even a meth-filled light bulb left behind. His old boss described him as hot-tempered and controlling, always dragging Jessica to work so he could keep an eye on her. There was also a roadside fight with his brother that ended with an arrest for assault and family violence. And even after he was sent to jail, things got worse. Another inmate said Blaine threatened to stab him with a pencil and had bragged about trying to escape. Piece by piece, the state showed the jury that Blaine wasn't just unstable, he was violent, controlling, and dangerous. But the defense pushed back. They brought in family, friends, and experts who all said the same thing. Blaine's life had unraveled long before Amora's death, and what happened was the result of a lifetime of trauma, not pure evil. Blaine's mother, Shirley, said her son had never grown up emotionally past the age of 12. He had been using meth for years, and things only got worse after his father died. Twice, Blaine tried to end his own life, saying he wanted to go be with his daddy. When that didn't work, Shirley tried to have him committed, but that never happened either. Just weeks before Amora's death, she said Blaine and Jessica showed up at her work carrying a Ouija board, convinced they could speak to their dead fathers. And then came the experts. A toxicologist testified that Blaine had massive amounts of meth in his system the morning Amora died, 10 times higher than any normal therapeutic level. Another specialist told the jury that Blaine was a long-time user, and that kind of drug use likely triggered a full-blown psychosis. Finally, psychologist Dr. Mark Cunningham tried to answer the two hardest questions. How did Blaine end up here, and what would happen if he spent the rest of his life in prison? He told the jury that Blaine's entire life had been shaped by a storm of mental health issues, substance abuse, and deep personal trauma, and that Jessica's own unraveling state only made it worse. All of it, he said, collided in the tragedy that claimed Amora's life. The defense begged the jury for mercy. They didn't deny how horrific the crime was, but they asked the jurors to see the broken man behind it. They said Blaine was deeply damaged and argued that life in prison would be punishment enough. Then they shifted the focus to Jessica. According to the defense, she was the one in control, unstable, manipulative, and unpredictable. They said she fueled the chaos in their relationship and steered Blaine deeper into delusion. Others supported that version of events. Lisa Taylor, a family friend from Alabama, remembered Jessica as a sweet and outspoken girl. But when Jessica visited in the fall of 2008 with Blaine and baby Amora, something felt different. According to Lisa, Jessica looked hollow, almost unreachable, like she was staring through people instead of at them. Amora went a full week without a bath during the visit, and Jessica barely seemed to interact with her at all. It was Blaine who fed the baby, changed her diapers, and did all the work. And to Lisa, Jessica looked like the one giving orders, while Blaine just followed. Later, a psychiatrist reviewed Jessica's background and diagnosed her with severe psychotic depression, a mental illness that can blur the boundary between what's real and what's imagined. The defense argued that she had spiraled out of control, that her mental state had deteriorated so badly she may have been the one responsible for everything that happened inside that trailer. And even the physical evidence wasn't as clear as prosecutors once believed. A defense expert had re-examined 5 of the wounds on Amora's body and concluded that neither Blaine nor Jessica could be definitively ruled in or out, which meant the bite mark evidence wasn't reliable enough to use. But in the end, none of it mattered. On May 17, 2010, after weeks of testimony and days of hearing evidence about both the crime and Blaine's troubled past, the jury in Montgomery County finally reached a verdict. They had already convicted Blaine of capital murder, but now came the punishment phase: life without parole or death. By a vote of 10-2, the jury recommended death, and the judge agreed. He officially sentenced Blaine to die later that year. At the time, he was the youngest person on death row in the United States. Jessica Bain Carson was also charged. In April 2011, a separate jury found her guilty of capital murder as a party to the crime, but instead of death, she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As of today, she is still serving that sentence. In a 2013 documentary in which Blaine was interviewed, he said that Amora was a great little girl whose first word was "Daddy," even though he wasn't her biological father. "I didn't kill my little girl," he said. "I wish I could go back and stop her, but I can't. I don't understand how it got this far, but it did." During Blaine's 15 years on death row, his legal team didn't stop fighting. Over the years, they raised 20 different claims on appeal, everything from intellectual disability to bad lawyering to alleged misconduct by prosecutors. But none of it stuck. Every single argument was denied, and the courts upheld both his conviction and his death sentence. And in 2025, he finally got a date. September 25th, 2025. After more than 15 years on death row, Blaine's time ran out. Under Texas law, inmates can no longer request a special last meal, so Blaine was served the same standard tray as everyone else. By 6 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney. When the warden asked if he had any last words, Blaine didn't hesitate. He thanked the prison's chaplaincy program, one that helped him find faith during his time on death row. He said it allowed him to be accepted into it to find Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Then he added, "And if any of you would like to see me again, I implore all of you, no matter who you are, to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and we will meet again." He then gave his last words, "I love you all. Bring me home, Jesus." At 6:19 p.m., the lethal dose of pentobarbital began flowing through the IV lines in his right hand and left arm. He grunted once, then gasped. Then his breathing slowed and turned into soft snores. Within minutes, the room went still. At 6:40 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Blaine Keith Milam was 35 years old. At that very same moment, in a different part of the country, another execution took place. After spending more than 26 years on death row, Geoffrey Todd West was executed by nitrogen hypoxia in Alabama. But to understand how he ended up on death row in the first place, we have to go back to a spring night in 1997 when a quiet gas station on Nakalula Parkway turned into the scene of a cold-blooded killing. It was the late hours of March 27, 1997, sliding into the early morning of the 28th in Gadsden, Alabama. Geoffrey was just 21 years old, but his life was already fractured beyond repair. He was deep into drugs, and he was out on parole after an earlier robbery conviction had sent him to prison. That night, he drove through the dark streets with his girlfriend, Amy Pierce, at his side. Their destination wasn't random. They were on their way to Harold Chevron, a small gas station off Nakalula Parkway. Geoffrey had worked there once. He knew the layout, the shifts, and the quiet moments when no one was watching. But this wasn't just a trip down memory lane. Geoffrey had a plan, and people in his circle had already heard the warning signs. He wanted to rob the Chevron, but not like last time. The last time, he had been caught, identified by a clerk who lived to tell the story. And that humiliation stuck with him. So this time, he promised things would end differently. He told people what he planned to do. He wouldn't leave no witnesses. His words were clear: kill the person up there. Inside the store, 33-year-old Margaret Parrish Berry was working the night shift. Geoffrey walked in with a .45 caliber handgun, and what happened next was fast. He pointed the weapon at her, forced her to the ground behind the counter, and took $250 from a cookie can where the store kept some of its money. Then he pressed the gun to the back of her head and pulled the trigger. He fired just one shot, and Maggie died immediately. Geoffrey then calmly walked back to the car where Amy was still waiting, got in, and drove away. And just like that, a life ended for just $250. But the police weren't far behind. The investigation moved quickly, and within hours, detectives were already chasing leads. And it didn't take long for a name to surface. Donna Mitchell, another Chevron employee, told investigators she had seen Geoffrey in the store a day or two before the shooting, and he hadn't been alone. With him was Joseph Scott Huey, a man detectives already knew well. Scott had a long history with law enforcement. He had been in and out of trouble for years, and sometimes even served as an informant, which made him easy to track down. Investigators went straight to him, and the connection between Scott and Geoffrey gave detectives their first solid lead. From that point on, the case moved quickly. Prosecutors would later tell the jury that the crime had been solved within 24 hours, and they weren't exaggerating. Donna's statement, the fact that Geoffrey had worked at the Chevron in the past, and his link to Scott gave detectives everything they needed. Geoffrey was arrested just days after the March 1997 murder, but it took much longer before his case ever reached a jury. 2 years later, in June of 1999, the trial finally began. By then, the state had built a mountain of evidence. There were the statements Geoffrey had made before the crime, telling people he wanted to rob the Chevron and leave no witnesses. There were the letters he wrote to his girlfriend, Amy Pierce. She admitted on the stand that she had blacked out lines because they made Geoffrey look guilty. And when a state document examiner used special lighting and chemical methods to uncover the original text, those hidden words pointed directly to Geoffrey's role in the murder. It all painted the same picture. Geoffrey planned the robbery, carried it out, and silenced Maggie to keep himself from being identified. On June 1, 1999, the jury convicted Geoffrey of capital murder during the course of a robbery, and that same afternoon, the penalty phase began. The jury had to decide life in prison without parole or death. Geoffrey's lawyer stood up and began to argue for mercy, laying out reasons why his client should be spared. But Geoffrey wasn't interested. In front of the court, he yanked his attorney back into his seat and told him not to say another word. He told him that he was innocent and said that he didn't want a life behind bars. If he couldn't walk out as a free man, he would rather die. And the jury took him at his word. By a vote of 10-2, they recommended death. A month later, on July 7th, the judge reviewed the case and agreed. Geoffrey was sentenced to die. And even though Geoffrey had asked for it, he likely didn't expect it would take nearly 3 decades before the sentence would finally be carried out. In those years, he filed appeal after appeal, hoping for a way out. But every attempt failed. The conviction and the death sentence stood. The court cited 2 aggravating factors. He had committed the murder while already under a sentence of imprisonment, and he killed Maggie while committing a robbery. His youth and limited criminal record were offered as mitigating factors, but in the end, they didn't matter. The brutality of the crime outweighed everything else. But Geoffrey wasn't the only one under scrutiny. Amy hadn't pulled the trigger, but she was still part of what happened that night and what followed. She wasn't just his girlfriend. She was there when Maggie died, and prosecutors said she played a role in what happened afterward. When investigators started pulling the case together, Amy's actions stood out. She had received letters from Geoffrey in jail, but instead of giving them to law enforcement, she tried to protect him. She blacked out the most damaging lines before handing them over. And because she was behind the wheel of the getaway car, prosecutors charged her with the same crimes as Geoffrey. She didn't escape accountability. They argued that she had helped hide the truth, covered for him, and tried to steer the investigation off track. Amy eventually pleaded guilty and agreed to testify. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison. But there's no record of her being held in any Alabama prison at this moment, 28 years after her arrest, which means she was released early. However, after 26 years on death row, Geoffrey's time was running out. A date had finally been set, September 25, 2025. The legal battles were over and the state was preparing to carry out the sentence. But not everyone was ready for it. Maggie's son had been just 11 years old when his mother was murdered. He was old enough to understand what had happened, but far too young to process the weight of it. For nearly 3 decades, he lived in the shadow of that night. He has watched as every headline, every court date, and every appeal has focused on Geoffrey. And through it all, the system kept making decisions in his name without ever asking what he wanted. Now, with Geoffrey's execution date set for September 25th, Maggie's son finally stepped forward with something no one expected. He didn't want Alabama to execute the man who killed his mother because it wouldn't bring her back. Instead, he wanted something else. A conversation, a face-to-face meeting with Geoffrey, to ask the questions that haunted him, and most of all, to say something no one expected. He forgave him. That decision came from faith. He believed in the words of Christ, that forgiveness opens the door to salvation. In his eyes, life in prison without parole was punishment enough. Death, he said, was the state trying to play God. And he had a message for him. "I love you," he wanted to tell Geoffrey. "God loves you. My mother would love you because we forgive you." Through his lawyers, Geoffrey agreed to the meeting. Even with time running out, he said yes. He didn't want to deny what happened. He admitted that he killed Maggie. At 50 years old, he said he still struggled to understand the choice he made at 21. From his cell, Geoffrey admitted the weight of it never left him. "There's not a day that goes by that I don't regret it. I wish I could take it back," he said. What he wanted most, he explained, was the chance to look Maggie's family in the eye and apologize. "I'm so very sorry for the hurt I've caused you all. I'm sorry for what I took from you. I hope and I pray that you can forgive me." Maggie's son believed his mother would have wanted that. He believed she had already forgiven Geoffrey, too. "I don't want this man to die," he said. "Vengeance isn't for the state, it's for the Lord." He begged Governor Kay Ivey to grant a reprieve. He asked for just a little more time. Time to sit down with the man who murdered his mother. He even delivered a petition to Governor Kay Ivey's office asking her to halt the execution. But the governor's reply was firm. She said she respected his belief, yet the law was clear. Alabama reserved death for what it called the most egregious forms of murder, and she had to respect that law. The clock kept ticking, and the state went forward with the execution. In the final weeks, Geoffrey and Maggie's son exchanged letters. Both men asked for a meeting before the execution, but the state refused, citing security concerns. This means that the wishes for his mother would not be granted. The two would not meet face to face, and Geoffrey was executed. On the evening of September 25, 2025, it was time. Geoffrey spent his final hours with 8 visitors, and for his final meal, he chose chicken quesadillas. His execution would be carried out using nitrogen gas, a method Alabama had only recently begun using. The process involved strapping a tight gas mask to his face and pumping in pure nitrogen, cutting off the oxygen he needed to survive. At 5:56 p.m., officers strapped him to the gurney. His face was calm, and he turned slightly to give his attorney a final thumbs up from behind the mask. When the warden asked if he had any final words, Geoffrey simply replied, "No, sir." But through his attorney, he left a message. He said he was deeply moved by the forgiveness offered by Maggie's son. He also shared he had converted to Catholicism earlier that year and had been baptized. "I am at peace," he wrote, "because I know where I'm going, and I look forward to seeing Mrs. Berry when I get there." Then the gas began to flow. For the first 2 minutes, he was conscious and seemed to struggle. His eyes stayed open. His chest heaved and his mouth twitched. His head rocked to the side and his left hand curled into a fist. He appeared to foam slightly at the mouth. Around 6:01, his breathing began to slow, shallow, broken by long gaps. And by 6:07, he stopped moving. He was pronounced dead at 6:22 p.m. Geoffrey Todd West was 50 years old. The last execution of the month took place on September 30th, 2025. After spending more than 32 years on death row, Victor Tony Jones was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. But what did he do to end up there? On December 19, 1990, around 10 a.m., Irene Fisher picked up the phone like she did every morning. She called her parents, 67-year-old Jacob Nestor and his wife, 66-year-old Matilda. They sounded fine, happy even. Just a cheerful chat between a daughter and her parents. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. And when they hung up, Irene's mom called right back, just to keep talking. They slipped right into girl talk, light and easy, before saying goodbye again. It felt ordinary, routine, but that was the last time Irene would ever hear their voices. Not long after, 2 more calls were logged from the Nestor's office line to Irene's number in Baldwin, New York. And the last call from their line came at 11:21 a.m. to a tooling company in Kansas City. Then the line went silent. Around noon, a UPS driver pulled into the lot of their shop like he did almost every day. Both of the Nestors' cars were parked out front, so he expected someone to be inside. But when he rang the bell, no one answered. He knocked again, calling out, "UPS? I've got a delivery." But still nothing. He then crouched and peered through the mail slot. And what he saw didn't make sense. Inside, the normally tidy office looked as if a storm had torn through it. Papers were scattered, chairs were pushed around. And then he noticed something else: blood. Spooked, he ran downstairs to find Ernesto Sorondo, the neighbor who ran the auto repair shop next door. Ernesto knew the couple well. He saw who came and went every day. And he remembered their new employee, too. A young man named Victor Jones had just started working for Jacob the day before. That morning, Ernesto had seen Dolly leave in her Volvo around 9:30 and return half an hour later. After that, he saw nothing unusual, until the UPS driver came looking for help. Together, they walked back upstairs and looked again through the narrow mail slot. This time, Ernesto saw it too. Blood on the floor, smeared across the desk, even splattered on the telephone. He didn't hesitate and immediately called the police. Officer David Magnuson of the Miami PD was the first to arrive. The building was locked up tight, with doors locked and windows barred. He crouched and looked through the same slot and spotted what looked like a human foot lying still on the floor. Firefighters forced the heavy front door open and paramedics rushed inside. But what they walked into wasn't just a crime scene, it was a bloodbath. Jack lay motionless on the floor in the main office. He had been stabbed in the chest. And a few feet away in the bathroom, officers found Dolly. She was face down near a shattered towel rack, her body limp and bloodied. She had been stabbed high in the back between the shoulder blades, the blade cutting through her aorta. She fell forward with such force that she hit her head as she collapsed, and blood streaked the wall behind her. Neither of them had a pulse. But they weren't alone. There was someone else in that room, someone who was still alive. Slumped on the couch in the corner of the office was 29-year-old Victor. A leather jacket had been pulled over his chest like a makeshift cover. Officers immediately spotted the blood on his sneakers and pants, and just under his arm, they saw it, the handle of a pistol. All three officers raised their weapons and shouted. For a second, Victor didn't move. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands and surrendered. They took the gun from beneath his arm, and when they checked it, it appeared to be cocked, loaded, and ready to fire. Around him, the room was chaos. The furniture was overturned, and blood pooled across the floor. Jack lay just a few feet away, his shirt soaked, his body already stiffening. But the heavy gash above his eye showed he had clearly fought back. After Dolly's collapse, he had faced his attacker head-on. The knife pierced his chest, but even as he bled, Jack pulled it out himself, reached for the phone, and stumbled for his gun, the same one police would later find under Victor's arm. Jack managed to fire 5 rounds, one even grazed Victor's forehead. But it wasn't enough. He fell right there, collapsing in a pool of his own blood. Victor never left the building. With the doors locked and no way out, he just sat on the couch and waited. When officers searched him, they found both Jack and Dolly's wallets in his back pockets. Her purse, keys, and coin pouch were tucked into his clothes. The blood on his shoes matched Jack's DNA. And when they checked the bathroom wall, they found Victor's fingerprints above Dolly's body, showing that he had leaned there as she lay dying. At first, it wasn't clear he had been shot, but after the police cuffed him, Victor complained of a headache. An officer noticed the bleeding wound on his forehead and asked what happened. Victor answered coldly, "The old man shot me." Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, and once he was stable enough to speak, he said something no one expected. In the ICU, he looked at a nurse and told her he needed to leave. When she asked why, he didn't hesitate. "Because I killed those people," he said. And when she asked why he did it, his answer cut like ice. "They owed me money, and I had to kill them." But how did it come to this? Why would a young man, just one day into his new job, turn on the very people who hired him? Investigators quickly started digging into who Victor Jones really was, and what they found was a boy already broken long before the crime. From the beginning, his life was unstable. His mother drank heavily during the pregnancy and after he was born, and by the time he was a boy, he and his siblings were scattered across relatives' homes. Victor and his sister Pamela ended up in Miami, living with their aunt Laura Ling. But he never settled. He ran away more than once, and at just 11 years old, he stowed away on an airplane bound for New York, hoping to find his mother again. She was still drinking, but he stayed with her anyway. For a while. By 13, Victor was back in Miami and already in serious trouble. He overdosed and ended up in the ICU, and by 8th grade, drugs and chaos had taken over. His grades collapsed, and by 16, he dropped out of school for good. The next few years, he ping-ponged through juvenile detention centers, bouncing from one state-run facility to the next. In 1978, when he was finally released, Victor tried to go straight. He picked up work as a waiter in Miami, but that didn't last. Restlessness set in, and soon he was on the road again, hitchhiking to Texas, selling drugs to get by, and picking up odd jobs in between. He drifted to San Francisco for a while, living off petty robberies, then circled back to Miami before heading to Atlanta, where he spent a few years working clubs and restaurants as a bouncer. He had girlfriends during that time and even lived with a woman he described as his common-law wife. But it was always the same story: short-lived jobs, quick cash, and no roots. In 1986, Victor returned to Miami once again. He was cutting lawns during the day and dealt drugs during the night. Then, on December 12, 1989, just a year before the murders, he pulled off a bold armed robbery at the Debbie School, a facility for hearing-impaired children on the campus of Jackson Memorial Hospital. Wearing a fake security guard uniform and carrying a gym bag, Victor walked inside like he belonged there. He forced his way into the school office and snatched the purse of Secretary Janet Herron. But before he could get out, two other women, Barbara Lewis and Nanette Martin, saw what was happening and intervened. They grabbed the bag from him and found a large knife hidden inside. Victor didn't back off, though. He just ran into another room, grabbed another teacher's purse, and sprinted out the door while the women chased after him, screaming for help. Outside, a security guard named Doug Tyrell heard the commotion. He didn't have a weapon, but he stepped in anyway. Victor punched him in the jaw, hard, but Doug didn't back down. He fought back and managed to pin Victor to the ground until the police arrived. Victor was arrested and later convicted of robbery and burglary with assault. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, but didn't serve all of it. He was released on November 27, 1990, barely a year after the robbery, and back in the community just 3 days later. But nobody knew that the decision to release him early would end up costing 2 people their lives less than 3 weeks later. Victor's trial began in 1992. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of armed robbery, and it didn't take long for the jury to convict him on all charges. During sentencing, the state pushed for death. They listed multiple aggravating factors. Victor had been under a sentence of imprisonment at the time. He already had a prior violent felony. The murders happened during a robbery, and he had killed for financial gain. His defense tried to save his life by pointing to his past. They told the jury Victor had been abandoned by his mother at a young age and that he suffered from lifelong emotional and mental instability. Over the years, Victor's IQ was tested multiple times. His scores fell between 67 and 75, low enough for some experts to argue he had intellectual disabilities, but not low enough for others to agree. A neuropsychologist named Dr. Eisenstein claimed Victor had struggled since childhood. He pointed to poor communication skills, difficulty learning, social isolation, lack of life skills, and neglect of his own health. In Eisenstein's view, Victor's history and IQ met the criteria for mental retardation. But not everyone saw it that way. Lisa Wiley, a psychological specialist with the Department of Corrections, worked with Victor for over a decade. She said he was always neat, respectful, and coherent on death row. He filed written grievances, asked for maintenance repairs when needed, and handled problems like anyone else would. In her opinion, Victor wasn't intellectually disabled at all. He fully understood what was happening around him. But neither opinion changed the outcome. The jury voted 10-2 in favor of death for Dolly's murder, but weren't unanimous for Jack's. Still, the judge overrode the recommendation in Jack's case and accepted the one for Dolly. On March 1, 1993, Victor was sentenced to death for each victim. In addition, he was given consecutive life sentences for the 2 robbery convictions. Victor kept fighting the sentence for decades, filing appeal after appeal, but every court upheld the original verdict. And in 2025, after more than 32 years on death row, the state of Florida finally gave him a date, September 30th, 2025. On the morning of his execution, Victor woke up at 4:30 a.m. He met briefly with a spiritual advisor but didn't receive any other visitors, according to a spokesperson for the Department of Corrections. Throughout the day, he followed all orders without resistance and stayed calm. When it came time for his final meal, he asked for fried chicken, collard greens, and sweet tea. The execution proceeded without any reported issues. When asked for his final words, he simply replied, "No, sir." After the drugs were administered, a guard followed standard protocol, calling Victor's name, brushing his eyelashes, and checking for a pulse. And he showed no response. At 6:17 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Victor Tony Jones was 64 years old. What do you think? Has justice been served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.